All right, so now we're going to start moving into evolution. And so, evolution, if you were to just boil it down and give it one simple definition, would just be changes in the genetic makeup, so in the genetics of a population over time. And so, it's very important that we realize that anytime we're using the term evolution, we are referring to a population. We are not referring to an individual. Like it would be great if you had gills, right? But you can spend as much time in the water as you want, and you are never going to evolve gills. Now, if humans spent all of their life on the near water and spending a lot of time within water, maybe individuals who had gills would do better. And so maybe over millions and millions of years we would evolve gills, but never an individual, right? That has to happen by chance, and it has to be determined by their genetics. And so we'll get to that. But we are first going to move into natural selection. So this is a major mechanism of evolution. This is not the only way by which evolution occurs. Okay, but it is the one that you've heard of. This is the one that you know. You know that natural selection is the big one for evolution. This is how populations change over time. And natural selection was arguably first described by Charles Darwin. He was an English naturalist, and he had a pretty interesting life in terms of what he wanted to do and what he ended up doing. But he is often the one credited with developing the theory of evolution by natural selection. That story gets a little muddied when we start looking at the actual history of that, and then we start talking about people like Alfred Russel Wallace, who was also involved in that process, and we'll get there. But he has the really, really famous trip around the world on the HMS Beagle. So that was the name of the ship, was the Beagle. And basically, this is his route that he went on. So he was an English naturalist, right? And so he started over there in Europe, and then he went all over. But most of his work that we think about and that we recognize occurs way down here in South America near the Galapagos Islands, right? That's like the most famous work. And so that's what we're going to really be talking about. But what he did is he collected and observed a ton of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils anywhere they went. Okay, so he had information from all around the world almost. And we pretty much just look at one little subsect when we talk about natural selection and regular biology. But when we get to AP biology, we kind of get the opportunity to look at more data and look at more of the story that he started to figure out in addition to some other individuals. And so what he found while he was traveling is that he was finding a lot of fossils, and he was finding fossils for species that were pretty similar to ones he already knew, but they were often a lot bigger than ones he already knew. And so this started to make him think about fossils being showing us like a look at the ancestors of modern species. Okay. And as I said, he made his most famous observations while on the Galapagos Islands. So that's going to be off the coast of Ecuador, okay, in South America. And these are Darwin's finches. These are the finches that you've seen. You've probably even seen these sketches before. It would surprise me very much if you had not. So Darwin started to notice that on the Galapagos Islands, there was a lot of variation of similar species. So there were a lot of these finches, and they like kind of had some similarities, but they also had a lot of diversity. So like if you look at these individuals right now, 1, 2, 3, and 4, you'll notice that maybe overall their head has a similar shape, but we see a huge diversity in their beaks, in some of their coloration, etc. And so specifically, he noticed that their beaks were adapted, and that's a newer term. He didn't use that term at the time, but they were best suited for specific foods, right? And this isn't shocking to us now, but you got to remember that he lived in a time where the idea of species changing over time didn't really make sense because they mostly thought about species as being designed and not changing, right? So being static across time. And so Darwin, much, much later, he did not do this while on his trip He started thinking about this more and more later after his trip, but he eventually concluded that the finches must have come from one original species. And over time, that species changed as the environment changed. And thus we got a bunch of different species across a bunch of different islands. And so this was kind of his hypothesis, and this was something that he published in a work called The Origin of Species. Okay. And in actuality, he was talking with another naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had made his own observations while in South America and had found some similar ideas. And Darwin was basically the person to talk to. And so Alfred Russel Wallace sent all of his notes over to Darwin, was like, hey, look at this thing I'm thinking about. And Darwin actually published their work together. And it's kind of unclear whether Darwin actually came up with all these ideas as well, or if he just kind of stole Alfred Russel Wallace's ideas. So, you never really know. But as far as Alfred Russel Wallace has said, he said, obviously he's long dead, but he said that it was a collaborative process, and he credited most of the heavy lifting to Darwin himself. So that's kind of what history has taken. And so you'll see a lot of images when you start thinking about evolution. You'll start to see that organisms will change over time. And it's very important to remember that these are not the same individual. This individual right here did not change into this individual, which changed here, 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 here. That's not how evolution works. It's a very gradual process that occurs over many, many generations. Okay, so it's all about traits moving from parents to offspring. That's why we're doing this after genetics, right? And we see a lot of really strong evidence that species change over time, and natural selection is the process responsible for most of that change. And so we're going to talk about some of those pieces of evidence later, but as just kind of an overarching basics of evolution and natural selection, Darwin basically stated that species compete for resources, and those resources could be basically anything. It could be food, it could be mates, it could be territory, it could be water. It could be literally anything that an organism needs, and we need lots of things, right? And their ability to compete with other individuals is what determines your ability to survive and reproduce. So basically, if you are better at getting resources, then you are better at surviving and better at reproducing. It's really all logic. And what you'll see later is natural selection is really just applied statistics as well. It's really just like, oh, I'm more likely. Does that mean I'm guaranteed? No, it just means that you're more likely to survive and reproduce. So it's really just a logical process. And so individuals within a species have a lot of variation, right? If you look at yourself and compare yourself to individuals within your family, even, there's a lot of variation. But also, if you look at individuals within our class, there's a lot of variation. No two individuals look exactly the same, and they have all these differences. And that can affect whether they are more or less likely to survive and reproduce. And this is one of the cruxes of natural selection. If everybody was the same, we'd all have the same likelihood to survive and reproduce. But we're not the same. We all have different likelihoods to survive and reproduce. So Darwin kind of started to talk about this idea, and he used, well, we use really a nice visual of giraffes to exemplify this. So basically, natural selection is just saying, hey, the organisms that are better adapted, they're more suited to their environment, will be more likely to survive and reproduce, right? That's all natural selection is saying. It's just saying, in general, nature will select for the individuals who have better traits. Okay? And over time, if you watch a population, those traits will become more and more common. So if a taller giraffe is better able to reach food, then over time, that giraffe is going to do better. And if that giraffe does better, they're going to be more likely to have babies, and thus there will be more of the tall alleles in that population. So it's just a directionality, right? Now, there's no necessarily good versus bad traits all the time. Maybe in this environment, it's good to have a long neck, but in a different environment, it would be bad to have a long neck. So it's important that context matters, right? Your environment matters. If your environment changes, maybe you're no longer suited. So, for instance, it may be great to have a fur coat in Alaska right now, but in 1,000 years, when with global temperatures changing so much, who knows if it'll be great to have a fur coat, right? Maybe it'll be bad. So, an adaptation today could very easily be a negative thing tomorrow. So, it's just something important to remember. And so Darwin started to realize that over time, natural selection is not just going to change the physical makeup of a species, it's going to change the genetic makeup because that's what determines those physical traits, right? And so your genes that are good or useful in an environment are going to be passed on to subsequent generations more so than other genes. And these eventually, as you change little bit by little bit in a species, they might eventually become a new species, right? And so this was his idea of how we have such diversity in life. Little changes over time, building up and building up and building up, and eventually all those little changes don't seem so little anymore. Now, the nearest species to you has a lot of differences from you, right? And so this led to Darwin coming up with an idea for a tree of life. And so this is a phylogeny example. We're going to have an entire chapter on phylogeny, so it's super, super important that you be able to read and use phylogenies. But for now, I just want you to see that we have here different organisms. I don't need you to worry about like, oh, this is where the bacteria end, this is where the archaea begin, this is where the eukaryotes begin, or anything like that. Just everything is connected. All of these things are related. They all have common ancestors. Okay? And the origin of life is going to be way back here, okay, towards the center of this little semicircle. Okay? So we have birds and mammals being closely related, but they're also related to fish and insects. But they're less closely related to insects than they are to each other. Right? So there's a lot going on here. I don't expect you to be an expert in this based on this chapter alone. We're going to be practicing with this. So to kind of zoom back into the individual, and we were talking about that variation. So in evolution, we have this term called fitness. And fitness is basically any individual's ability to survive and reproduce. So your traits are going to determine your fitness. So perhaps, given your environment, having a fur coat will increase your fitness. It will make you more likely to survive and reproduce. Okay? But if I took you and put you in a different environment, maybe that same fur coat would decrease your fitness. So context always matters. Okay? And some species will like some traits, while other species will dislike those traits. And I shouldn't say like, dislike so willy nilly, but it's all about whether it's beneficial to you or not. Okay? So some organisms might favor strength or speed, while others might favor the ability to camouflage or hide themselves. And most interestingly, often organisms will kind of, instead of prioritizing survival, they're going to prioritize mating potential. So sometimes there's weird courtship displays. Sometimes you're going to have individuals that will literally sacrifice their lives just to have a chance at reproducing a little bit more than another individual. And so we're going to talk about that when we get to sexual selection. But before we get there, just kind of zooming out, populations as a whole, there must be variation amongst members of a population. If everybody was the same, then everybody has the same chance of surviving and reproducing. Nothing's ever going to change, right? But that's not the case. In populations, we have variation. We have individuals that are different, and those differences allow us to have different fitnesses. Okay? So, our genetic variation leads to a physical variation. And genetic variation, we've seen cases of genetic variation occurring already. We have seen that mutations can occur, changes in your DNA can occur, and that can allow you to develop new traits. We've seen that meiosis can lead to variation, making different gametes with different combinations of alleles. will lead to different children with different traits. And just sexual reproduction in general. You're not cloning yourself, right? When you're doing sexual reproduction, you are taking half of one individual, half of another, and creating an entirely unique individual. So that creates even more variation. So when we start talking about the genetics of a population, we use this term gene pool. So just picture a big old pool of genes, right? And so we start talking about the diversity of a gene pool. So if the gene pool of a population is very diverse, that means that the species has a lot of diversity in it. Okay. And environments are changing all the time, especially when humans started getting introduced. We change the environment like crazy, right? In so many ways. And so, if you have more diversity in your population, that can help your overall species to survive. Now, to you, the individual, you only care about your survival, right? You don't care about the population as a whole. You just want to be able to survive yourself and find a mate. That's what you care about in the context of natural selection. But for the species as a whole, it's important to have that variation. And so, a good way to think about this is coloration, right? If we only had one color of this butterfly and all of a sudden the color of the environment changed, well, now everybody's going to die. But if we had like little variations of color and the environment changed, maybe some of those individuals are going to have better colors to blend in, right? And so butterflies and moths are a classic example of this. Of course, we have the peppered moth that we're going to talk about very briefly. But just remember that if your environment changes, that's going to change how your population as a whole progresses through natural selection. So here are some really, really great videos talking about evolution, talking about stuff that people get wrong about evolution all the time, and also just overall how it works. So I would highly, highly, highly recommend this top video, the Kurzgesagt video on how evolution works. If we have time in class, I'm going to show it as well. It's just a really good overall summary of what evolution needs in order to occur and how it gets that, and then what actually drives it. Okay. And so rather than ending the lecture here, I want to move on and start talking about adaptations. Okay, so adaptations are specifically the traits that allow you to better survive and reproduce, that allow you to have a higher fitness. Okay, so this is another vocab term that's very important. And so typically, you're going to see that adaptations have a structure, and that structure affects their function, right? So polar bears have white fur, that's their structure, right? And then that allows them to camouflage in their environment. Okay, so that's their function. So white fur structure allows for camouflage function in their environment. If I took a polar bear and I put it into a forest, it would not blend in anymore. It would be ridiculous, right? So it's always important to remember that context matters. Plants do the exact same thing. It might not be as dynamic and interesting to us because we aren't plants, so it's hard for us to like picture plant life. But they do a lot of things with structure with their flowers, if it's a flowering plant. So, like for instance, flowers are pretty much designed to just attract pollinators. And so sometimes it's good to have a tube-shaped flower so that maybe you get a hummingbird to come pollinate you. Or maybe it's good to have a red flower because some organisms prefer red over purple, right? And some flowers will have ultraviolet light that we cannot see, but we know is there based on the molecules that are there, and we can use spectroscopy to see the coloration that we cannot. We can see the wavelengths of light that we cannot see in our visual spectrum. So plants will do the exact same thing, and it's just harder for us to notice. Okay? And adaptations are going to change over time and get passed on, right? So having a longer neck was an adaptation, and then over time, having that longer neck helped those individuals that had it to survive and reproduce more, and thus over time, eventually more and more individuals had longer necks. Right. So it's a very gradual process. We didn't just go straight from this left picture to this right picture right away. It took time. Okay. And so it's always important to remember that the only way that these traits will be passed on is through reproduction. So you may have the best trait in the world. You may, like, imagine a human with wings. That's awesome. We can fly. But if that individual does not ever reproduce, maybe they died young, maybe something else happened. If that individual never reproduces, there is no chance for that trait to be passed on in the population. So the same thing is true of other organisms. Maybe this zebra has a great trait that's going to help it survive so great, but maybe it still gets sick when it's young and it dies. And so the population just doesn't get a chance to get that great trait. It won't pass on, it won't perpetuate. So we also need to start thinking about chance and randomness in evolution, because there's chance all over. There's chance with meiosis, there's chance with mutation, right? There's chance with forest fires and volcanic eruptions and disease spreading. There's so much chance involved that it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. And you just need to remember that just because something helps you survive and reproduce, that is not a guarantee. Okay, those individuals will still die sometimes early, right? And so I don't expect you to be able to use this mathematical model yet. At this point, there's an entire chapter for Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, but I just want to introduce it now so we can start thinking about it. Basically, as we see these traits and these, therefore, alleles, right, the alleles that determine those traits, fluctuate within a population, we need to be able to track that. And so we actually have mathematical means by which we can track genotypic frequencies and allele frequencies within the population. We can see if something is actually becoming more common within that population, and thus whether that population is actually evolving. And so that's going to become a really important and really useful skill for us. And it will be a little daunting at first because we're starting to use mathematics in the context of evolution. But with enough practice, I'm sure you guys are going to get it great. So we need to start thinking about random chance, and random chance kind of takes us back to this probability situation where we have what looks like a Punnett square, right? What we have here looks like a Punnett square, but it's important to remember that Punnett squares are just representations of statistics. So we're not doing the exact same thing with the Punnett square that we did before, but it's important to remember that we have a lot of similarities between the two. And so I'm not going to go through Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium at this time, okay, because there's an entire chapter for it. I just wanted to introduce it and get you thinking about how we can measure evolution, because this is a way by which we can actually assign numbers to evolution just to verify that it's actually happening. Okay. And so here are some videos on adaptations and different interesting examples of said adaptations and whether competition is important for evolution, and then a little bit on Hardy-Weinberg. I don't expect you to be an expert in Hardy-Weinberg yet. We're going to get there, right? So this will basically be our primer for evolution. This is our introduction into how natural selection works. It's really simple, right? It's, hey, I'm more likely to survive and reproduce because I have this cool trait. And therefore, if I have more kids than my neighbor, then I'm going to pass on that trait more than my neighbor will pass on his or her traits, right? And so you need to just understand that conceptually, and then we're going to be doing a lot of case studies and examples of that in action. So that's really where we get most of our useful information from in evolution, is from actual real world examples where we can measure evolution occurring in real life. So next time we're going to be talking about the evidence we have of evolution. So basically how we know this truly is happening. And so that way you don't have to just take my word for it, right? Evolution especially used to be a really hot button issue. And a lot of people think that it is completely incompatible with modern religions, right? People think that like you're either religious or you believe in evolution, and that's simply not the case. Like I know so many people who believe in both, right? They say that this is the means by which the thing that they believed beforehand occurs. And so I don't want you to just immediately, depending on your beliefs and all that, I don't want you to just immediately say evolution isn't real or evolution is real. I want you to look at the evidence. And so that's going to be where we go with our next lectures. We're going to start looking at how evidence can actually show us that things are happening. This is a real phenomenon. So I will see you next time with that.